the imaginal. I'm not talking about the imaginary, but so I have two devices here. I have a little key ring, and then I have a 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch adapter for musical instruments, right? So if I were to put these in my pocket, in my jeans here, and you tell me, now, Nick, you tell me to reach in my pocket and get one.
Mm-hmm.
Which one you want me to get?
Oh, pull out the 1/8 inch adapter.
Okay, so I'm gonna pull out the adapter. Now, what's happening in my mind right now is I'm creating an imaginal version of that 1/8 inch adapter that I can't see.
Right.
See, I'm imagining it and I'm comparing that imagination with what my fingers feel, and then I can pull it out.
Right.
So that's the difference between imaginary and imaginal. Imaginary is, things that don't exist, but imaginal can also exist if you're trying to build something. Like I want to put a shelf on the wall right there, and you have an imaginal conception, like a vision of
Yes.
how the shelf is going to look by the time you're finished. And
Right.
then you create the plan and the map and that kind of thing. So we
So
have a difficult time, like those are little things that we do all the time that once you start trying to build AI, we're finding that AI does not do those things very well, but we do them on the norm all the time.
well, it sounded to me like a lot like the notion of faith that you have explained, like with the bridge building,
Yeah,
where you
yeah,
have to have an image of the thing in a future tense. It doesn't need to be completed. It just needs to be further along in process
right.
in some way, in cast out into the future. And it's funny because it's almost like your cognition as your body sort of follows that imaginal anticipation
Yep,
of
yep.
um whatever it is you're pursuing, I guess you could say. So there's a lot of crossover there, I think, with the cognitive language
Yep.
or AI language or whatever you want to call it, and I guess you could say biblical language or religious language.
So yeah, I mean, the Bible says where there's no vision, the people perish. And people have to be aiming towards something
Mm-hmm.
in order to, that human spirit. They
Mm.
have to be aiming, aspiring towards something.
Yeah.
And so where there's no vision, the people perish, you could say that that's a cognitive science phrase that says where you cannot operate in the imaginal, you will perish. You see?
Mm.
And that imaginal space is something like faith, where it's not this, the new atheist where we believe in sky daddy things that can't be proven. It's a way that we have to operate. Like you have faith in a spouse, like me and Paula, we envision ourselves together in the future interacting in a particular way, and we continue to move toward that.
Yeah.
You know,
So it sounds like we're kind of separating a little bit from like what like human cognition can do versus what we're saying AI can do. And one of the other things that just
well,
occurred
yeah,
to me.
the difficulties of AI is basically teaching us what we're doing because we're discovering what we're not able to make it do. What are we doing that we
Right.
can't make it do? And
So
that's where we learn these things.
So one of the other things that just occurred to me that it can't do, AI, is we just drew out a little bit of a scenario and had a little demonstration of your ability to use the functionality of your imaginal power in order
Right.
to act in the world in some way. We linked that to faith, and faith is very tightly knit to meaningfulness, what it means to you. And so, one of the imaginal things that I think that I did when you presented the object to me was I asked myself the question, what does this object mean to me? And what it meant to me was, one of the things I was able to do was draw inference of where does this thing come from. So in my imaginal space, I imagined like some sort of a hand worker or some sort of a person manufacturing this thing. I can't see a space or a world where like a machine could be could number one infer meaning at all, or at least apart from like semantic meaning. But I took like a not a future tense meaning of what could I do with this thing, but like a past tense chain of events of where does this thing come from, and tried to draw some meaningful inference about that. Like, so what does that imply for me? Like, could I make something like that? Because I've got something kind of like that right here.
My stuff's better.
So that's another thing that I think that the imaginal space has the power to do, is not just to propel us forward in terms of action, but also infer what something might mean to us in a history or a sequence of events in the past. I don't think a computer asks itself, or an artificial intelligence asks itself, where does the object come from?
So we extrapolate an origin story.
Exactly.
When we encounter things.
Exactly. And I think
that's actually a really good point.
I think that's a really, really, really important, a key factor to point out, because I think one of the generally speaking, in terms of what it means to be a human, or a human cognitive agent, is to ask yourself about origin. Where do I come from? It's like we naturally ask that kind of a question impulsively. We've been doing it.
Where did I come from?
Exactly. So when we have an object put in front of us, it's like we use our imaginal space to infer, where does this thing come from? That's a whole massive process in itself, never mind the future tense, or what could I do with this thing, or what could I do with myself, where am I going?
And how is this relevant to me? How is this key ring relevant to me? Is there a key that I would like to put on this? So what I want to do now is I want to introduce another term, and then I want to talk about the landscape of things, and then I want to talk about I'm going to get closer and closer to my prediction here.
Okay.
And in order to make this term, I'm going to share my screen and show what I want to talk about. An egregor is an occult concept representing a thought form or collective group mind, an autonomous psychic entity made up of and influencing the thoughts of a group of people. The symbiotic relationship between an egregor and its group has been compared to the more recent non-occult concepts of the corporation as a legal entity and the meme.
Okay.
This is another definition from a different source. Egregoros, wakeful, is an occult concept representing a non-physical entity that arises from the collective thoughts of a distinct group of people. So what I'm going to propose, and I've done this before, is basically that something like Calvinism is an egregor. It is an entity that is brought into being by the collective thoughts and beliefs and affirmations of those who are caught up in that thought system. So that could pertain to a denomination, could pertain to all of Christianity, but specifically certain ways of thinking about things, and specifically, in my opinion, things that constitute static ways of thinking or very bounded ways of thinking. For example, if you work for Apple, you must think in a way that brings more profit to Apple shareholders. So you have constraints and restraints on what you can and cannot think, and how you optimize what you're going to be doing.
Right. So to be clear, it's a static way of thinking insofar as you are only any sort of progression or growth or fluidity or movement that's going to happen is going to be in service
Yes.
back into
In service to
egregor.
some kind of value that is held a priori.
Right. And therefore the egregor itself can actually grow in size, in influence, in power, in
Yes.
articulation, in
Yep.
sophistication, this, that, and the other thing. But as far as its stasis is a product of its inability to maybe speak to or communicate with anything outside of what it is. If that makes sense.
Say that last sentence again. To do what outside of anything of what it is?
So its stasis is a product of it is static insofar as it can only it cannot move or speak to or communicate to anything outside of its own self in a way that moves forward.
Not in a way that provides coordination in a complicated environment.
Right.
Outside of itself, only within itself, and only toward the goal. So the goal is kind of like a paperclip maximizer, the Moloch thing. The goal of the egregor of Calvinism is quite simply to persuade as many people as possible to affirm the tenets of Calvinism. So
what I'm seeing then is, if you bring up that image that you brought of the egregor over the city. So if to further expand upon Kevin's notion of that it's static like thinking, the only growth that it will have or transformation that it will have will be a self like growth. So what that means is that it will be an entity that doesn't have an environment. So when you look at that image, you see that the egregor is very obviously a thing that does not fit inside of the context of the environment, which is why it's
keyword context. Yes.
That's why it's probably so easy for people in the chat or people listening to come up with any ideology is an egregor, because it's so easy to identify something that is not fitted to a context. So like something like Calvinism, once you identify it as an egregor in and of itself, you would know that it has no place in like the real world. It has no environment that it's fitted, nested nicely into. It's just that for linguistic reasons and, offshooting reasons, people would say, well, its environment is Christianity. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It camouflages itself within an environment of Christianity or Christendom.
Yeah, you would say that, but I would say the context. So that doesn't have any real context, except so there's like a fabricated context of Calvinism.
Yes.
Egregor.
Yes.
So in the same way that the context of high fructose corn syrup is in corn, that's the actual context, but it gets decontextualized and put into Captain Crunch, and Mountain Dew, you see.
Yes.
And so it is a completely synthetic context that does not exist in the natural world as it is found.
Right. Okay.